The Warners obeyed every form of mourning etiquette in preparing the house for Rebecca's funeral, even though they expected only a few people would be able to attend because of the snow. The morning after she died, the family despaired of burying her with any speed. The coffin had been ordered weeks ago, of course, but with the ground frozen under a foot of snow, digging a grave would be next to impossible. Coretta and Amanda Etheridge, Aunt Clara, Mrs. Dow, and Mrs. Brighton took care of the problem for them. When they arrived to prepare the body, the women informed them that every available male Everett, Etheridge, Brighton, and Dow was out with picks at the burial plot, and that they wouldn't be allowed back home until the grave was finished. Indeed, the men worked in shifts all that day and night, taking refuge in the barn when they weren't digging, and refusing to come inside the house for warm beds. By the afternoon of the second day, the Warners were able to bring Rebecca in from the cooling board in the icy lean-to at the back of the barn, and place her properly in the coffin in the parlor for the funeral the next morning. That night, T could not sleep any better than he usually did, but neither could he sit up and write, since Sam Etheridge and Johnny Brighton were bunking with him as the only other young man in the house. Doubly vexing was the claustrophobic array of mourning drapings in his room. He had to leave it to avoid the feeling that he, too, was being closed up in a grave. But Teague's candlelight seemed only to make the darkness more oppressive, for wherever in the house it fell, it illuminated the black crape that covered every window and mirror, so that the reflections that would ordinarily multiply the light were gone. It was a lonely effect, so with more of an instinctive need than any conscious motive, he sought the only other light in the house. He stood in the doorway of the parlor for a moment, drew his jacket closer, for there was no fire here, and got his first real look at Anna Lee in the past 3 days. She had shut herself in her room the night Rebecca died, and had not re-emerged until late the next afternoon, when she joined the other women in their bustled preparation for the funeral. Now she sat in the large cushioned chair her father always claimed, and watched Rebecca's stillness in the coffin at the center of the room. Annalie's hair was drawn into a severe knot, and greased straight so that not even a strand of curls escaped. The grease alone reflected the candlelight in the room. The darkness here was worse than anywhere else, for her dress was like an empty hole in space, black, dull wool, with no luster whatsoever glancing off the fabric. It was as if all the light in the dim room were sucked into the black and squashed there. "If you stare at her long enough, it looks like she's breathing," she said, and her voice was like the crackle of an autumn leaf that had fallen to the ground and dried up, like someone could come along and break her into dust and then blow her away. Teague pulled one of the chairs set out for the next day's service over beside her and sat down. He gave no reply, but simply placed a hand briefly on the knot of her hair at the nape of her neck, and wondered if this new tightness would be permanent. "I kept thinking before she died that it'd be just like with Tom," she continued. "I was inconsolable. We couldn't have a real funeral like this. They had to seal up the coffin in Washington after they exhumed it, so Papa could bring it home. They said that the heat and air would react with the chemicals from decomposition, that the coffin could actually explode on the ride home if they didn't seal it. So we had to be ready to bury Tom as soon as Papa could get a wagon to bring him from the train. It was such an odd feeling to realize that it's not dust to dust at first, that we liquefy. We become this gelatinous—" "I know," Teague said, and Annalie nodded. "Yes, you would." "The whole week Papa was gone to Washington I cried. Then I'd calm down for a few minutes until a new thought or memory of Tom would come unbidden, and I'd cry again. I couldn't pass his room without crying because it still had his smell in it. The day we buried him, Mama got angry with me. She told me to stop carrying on so, that Tom wouldn't want to see me so upset. But she had no qualms about sitting down on the ground and wailing while they lowered him." Annalie folded her hands in her lap. "But now there's nothing in me. Nothing." Teague fumbled with the handle of his cane, and saw the fog of his breath drift out of view somewhere between him and the shrouded figure in the middle of the room. "Aren't you cold?" he asked. "Shall I build a fire?" "No. She's kept well so far. I don't want her to spoil by getting too warm." They sat a long while before Annalie spoke again. "Maybe it's different because he died so suddenly. We had just seen him that spring, running with me to the creek, bouncing Lucy on his knee, picking arguments with Papa. He was that much like you, questioning everything. He'd mentioned Darwin or Lyell. I don't think he really believed in any of it. He just wanted to get Papa's ire up because it hardly ever gets up, and Tom simply relished matching wits. He was the only one bright enough to hold his own against Papa, and I think Papa liked the challenge too. And all we could do for him was to say some prayers at the graveside." She stopped for a moment. "Papa wasn't quite out of mourning when he met you." She leaned her head back against the chair and shut her eyes. "You should go to bed." "I can't sleep knowing she's right underneath me like this, any more than you can sleep with all those men in your room." "Well, you can't sit here and freeze." Teague stood, went down the hall to the linen closet, and came back with 2 blankets. "I'll sit with you for a little while, but I don't want to freeze either." "You can sleep here for all that. The quiet will no doubt become tiresome. I'll just watch her until my eyes get too weary." Teague watched with her for a tentative moment, then spoke in a more hushed tone than he had been using. "I envy her, I think. Tom and her both." "You envy them dead?" Teague didn't respond immediately. "I envy them having people to miss them so terribly. I envy Tom not seeing battle. I envy them that certainty that you all seem to have. I envy that they got to keep it. I envy him, and I envy Rebecca, the complete lack of feeling, of knowing. They don't suffer." "She's not suffering anymore. I could scream every time someone says that. It's an empty phrase we say simply because it's just what you're supposed to say. Please, don't you do it too." Teague nodded and wished for a fire to stare into, or at least some embers to see flare and then fade out of existence. It didn't do to stare at Rebecca too long, for she did seem to draw breath under the thin shroud, and the idea of her opening her mouth in that blue-tinted face was nightmarish. "That night and day when I locked myself away," Annalise spoke again, "I sat by the window and watched the snow cover everything. I opened my window and stuck my hand out on the outside sill. The flakes would hit it, but the heat from my hand melted them before I could get a good look at their design. It made me angry. But then I thought that if I could go out and stay long enough, my heat would be used up, and the snow could cover me. I could lie down, and the snow could make a cocoon around me, and I'd open my eyes and see all the whiteness right there at my face. And I would be able to focus on the individual flakes and study their designs, and everything in the world would make sense. Then I thought of how absurd that fantasy was, that I could understand if I could only hide away. I had done the same thing after Tom died, and it didn't help anything. And I had tried again during the raid." Annalie glanced over at Teague with a weak smile, and then returned her face back toward Rebecca. "Papa thought I had ridden through some bad air and taken ill. Why else would you have found me covered to my head in the middle of summer? But I really rode through a contraband settlement, and what put me in that bed was a profound need to hide from a truth I'd learned about myself. I watched a man bleed to death from a gunshot wound he got because he happened to be a farmer on the lookout for chicken thieves. No one even knew his name. His family will never know what became of him. He shamed me. His blood shamed me. It was all in my dress and shoes, and when I got home and shed those things, my skin was splotched red where the blood had soaked through and dried. I scrubbed and scrubbed at it, afraid I would miss a place, and somebody would see it and know me for a hypocrite, because that moment, in the shanty, I was going to stand back and leave him for another to save." Annalie brought her knees up to the chair and repositioned herself so that she faced Teague with her cheek against the chair's cushion. "All my life I knew I'd go to heaven," she said. "Isn't that strange? that I could be so arrogant and not even realize it. I was so certain that I could help you and give you that same assurance. I was going to correct you, bring you to repentance, and if you rejected my efforts, I could simply shake the dust off my feet and be gone. But after that night, when I lay nearly smothering under the cover, I realized how utterly unfit I am. It was the first time I questioned my place in heaven. Can you believe that? And though I'd read it so many times, I only then understood what it meant to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And I determined then to shake off the dust around you, not because you were unworthy, but because I was. Teague didn't immediately break the silence that followed, but marveled at her contrition that, as far as he was concerned, was unnecessary. "And did you get the dust off? You're still quoting Scripture at me." Annalise smiled her appreciation of the attempted humor, settled deeper in the cushion, and pulled the blanket closer. "Well, the ground around you is so muddy it's going to take me a while to kick it off." Teague smiled too, and leaned his head on the wing of her chair. They stayed like this, half sitting, half lying, close enough to feel the warmth of the other's breath, until the sense that sunlight shone outside the darkened windows stirred them from the best and most undisturbed sleep either of them had known for a long time.